This week in the Regency, it's the second week of the month, and therefore it's about fashion. Fashions for March. Now, this month, we're taking the fashions from Drakkard's Stamford News. But before we get to that, I thought I would share something that I have figured out for you. When I go into the newspaper archive and I look for fashions for March, because I know that every month there will be in the smaller newspapers, there will be this article that says fashions for January, fashions for February, fashions for March. When I look for that, what I get is a long list of identical articles from smaller papers all over the country. Bath, Chester, Lincoln, Sheffield, in this case, Stamford. And I realized that what we were looking at here was an early case of syndication. They are descriptions. There's three. There's always three. Typically a walking dress, an evening dress, and either a ball gown or something from France. And clearly they get this from La Belle Assemblée. La Belle Assemblée comes out in the first week of the month. 5 to 10 days later, depending on the mails and on when, often these newspapers only came out once or twice a week. So depending on when they come out in their particular location. So anywhere between a week and 10 days, out comes Fashions for March. So I think that's really interesting. The timing shows that we haven't got railways yet, and we certainly don't have the telegraph, but we do have toll roads. And so the information, the letters, it's on them that have come on the mail coach, and each of these towns was big enough to have a mail run. So they came on the mail coach. It took a few days to get there, and then depending on the newspaper schedule of publication, they came out usually in the second week. So I thought that was quite interesting. Fashions for March: a walking dress, a round dress composed of dove-coloured tabinet. The skirt is gored and very full at the bottom. The trimming consists of a bias piece of satin of about 1/4 of a yard in breadth, which is ornamented with gauze, roses, and bands of velvet. The former are placed lengthwise, 3 together, in a slanting direction. The latter, which are edged with a beautiful narrow silk trimming, are placed between the roses. The body is made half high. It is tight to the shape. The waist is very short, and the sleeves are long and tight to the arms. Now, we can see that this is obviously a dress for colder weather, and it has over it a very long pelisse, which matches it, obviously. And what's interesting there is the kind of relationship between the outer and the inner, which I'm going to get back to later on in the video. When we look at these images, going in on them is really interesting, and you can see that they had to really pick what they described, and that what they typically picked, I've come to realize, is how to make it. So it's not just a description of the dress itself. It's a bias piece of satin. That's a dressmaker's instruction: how to cut the satin, how to place them lengthwise, 3 together in a slanting direction. You know, this is about, well, if you want to copy this dress, this is how you have to do it. And I think that is worth realizing, that people out in the country, in the rural areas, were using these descriptions when they didn't get La Belle Assemblée themselves. They were using these descriptions in order to create their own clothes. The next piece is a French opera costume. A pelisse of white satin trimmed with swan's down. The swan's down's still in fashion. You remember it was from the last time. And left open at the throat. Dress hat of white satin surmounted by a superb plume of ostrich feathers. sash of broad satin riband tied behind, white satin slippers and white kid gloves. Now, it's interesting that this is black and white. It's clearly an etching they've had brought over from Paris. The La Belle Assemblée had a Paris correspondent. We don't ever find out her name, but she writes a letter every month for them, and presumably sources their French images, but only could get black and white this time. Now, here's the interesting thing. The third one here, the evening dress, a round dress composed of satin-striped gauze of a dark puce colour, it's quite dark, over a satin slip. The skirt is very full, particularly at the bottom, and is ornamented with 2 rows of light silk trimming, which is set on in waves. Again, telling you how to do it. The body is cut low around the bust. The back is plain. The sleeves are short and very full. Now, evening dress sleeves were always short rather than to the wrist. Now, the interesting thing about this is when I went to La Belle Assemblée of March 1819, there is no image of this. And what's interesting is there's only 2. There's only 2 things described under the fashion section, the black and white French picture and the blue. There's no 3, and yet there's always 3. And this is where I started thinking about syndication, because clearly the local papers, the rural papers, they are paying for 3 a month. That's what they've paid for. And so this month, where they didn't have 3 images, they have cobbled together a description of an evening dress. I went looking for this description in La Belle Assemblée. It's not there. It's composed of a number of other items that they talk about being in fashion, like the satin striped gauze they talk about in another section as being fashionable, and the full skirt being fashionable, that kind of thing. And so what they've done, because they didn't have 3 in that magazine that month, they have written another one specifically for the syndication. So that, I think, is really interesting. Obviously, I find many things interesting. But it goes to show that this was a business arrangement. It wasn't the rural papers getting La Belle Assemblée and picking up and effectually plagiarizing the descriptions they had. This was something that La Belle Assemblée was providing to these papers for a fee. And they were paying for 3, so they got 3, even though in the magazine there was only 2. So while I was scouring the magazine to find this description of the other evening dress, and hopefully find an image, I came across something else I thought you would like. This is from the Parisian Correspondent. And she talks about the fashions in quite a lot of detail, which is very interesting. But she also talks about other fads and what's going on in the world of the fashionable in Paris. And one of the things she's picked up on is what do you give people for presents? I have often thought that the present race of those we call our friends, who show their regard by presents, must be the most forgetful beings in the world. Writing boxes, snuff boxes, and every kind of trinket are now ornamented with the word souvenir. Now, in French, souvenir means memory. So presumably the idea was that you gave a present to a friend with souvenir, and it was like, remember me. Every time you look at this, you can remember me. So she goes on to describe some of these, and some of them sound like the kinds of things that we have seen, snuff boxes and those kinds of things. And snuff was still used quite a lot in this period. And then she gets to a small work basket in the shape of a lozenge is reckoned a very superb present for a souvenir. It is covered with white satin and trimmed with English point lace, expensive. It stands, this is where I went, what? It stands on 4 feet, composed of diamonds. 4 little diamond feet. At every corner is a ring of gold and a handle of gold at the summit. The outward cover is ornamented with drawings from Isabey. Now, Isabey is a contemporary artist. He's alive and working at this point. He was quite well known. This is what he looks like. He doesn't die until 1855, so he's at the height of his career at this point. So paintings by Isabey, well, that's very fashionable indeed. Remembering, of course, that this is in France. So he's working in France. He was working on portraits at Versailles and other places by this period after the restoration of the monarchy there. So he's a very fashionable artist indeed in France. So I was interested in all of that because of this relationship between the rural papers and magazines, and I'm going to go look for more of that sort of stuff. But I also was interested, as I was reading through the March issue, I was interested in the general discussion about overdress, so police suspensors, and a thing called the witchura, which I had never heard of before. But it's this particular kind of police. This is the quote: when the rude breath of Boreas, now Boreas is the north wind, when the rude breath of Boreas will, however, prevail, as is frequently the case at this period, that is March, nothing is reckoned so elegant for the walking costume as the warm witchura pelisse. So I had no idea what that is, so I went on a little expedition to find out. This is a witchura. It's a Polish word. It means wolf fur coat, and typically it was lined, at least at the edges and in the hood, with various kinds of fur. And the difference between a normal pelisse, as you would see on the blue dress, and this is that the hood is, as you can see in this image, is big enough to come up over the top of your bonnet. And so presumably it is indeed a perfect outdoor garment. But the interesting thing about it is that it was introduced by this woman who was Napoleon's mistress, Napoleon Bonaparte. And her intention apparently was to, she was using her charms deliberately in order to get Napoleon to allow Poland to be a free state. So hats off to you, Marie. She introduced the witchura to France, and because she was, his favorite at the time, it became very fashionable, and it stayed fashionable long after he was demoted, shall we say, to Elba and then St. Helena. People still wore it, and the reason they wore it was because it was really warm and comfortable, and you could signal your social status quite a lot by the kind of fur you had it lined with, particularly ermine. So that's fashion for March 1819. That's This Week in the Regency. I'm Elizabeth Leyden. I'll see you next week in the Regency.